Well, as we get started this week, you'll notice I don't have a PowerPoint tonight. I'm sorry, it's been a crazy week and I just didn't get it done. But I want us to start out with questions. And I know that there were some in Sunday school this morning that I was told would be coming tonight. So Sharon, let me get the microphone. And the reason that we do the microphone is not just so that Jack can hear you, but also so that when we do the recording that it is available for that as well.
Well, as I was reading about Jesus going up on the mountain with Peter, James, and John, that Peter, James, and John saw Moses and Elijah with Jesus. And I was wondering, how did they know that it was Elijah and Moses?
Okay, that's a very good question. Very good question. And I know that in Sunday school they all acknowledge that's a very good question. I don't know that I have the 100% answer. What I have is most scholars believe that the cloud was what told them who this was. Meaning the significance of the glory cloud. This wasn't just a cloud that happened by, but the glory cloud that God himself descended upon Mount Sinai when he gave Moses the law. This is the cloud. So Moses would have been, oh yeah, it's the cloud, therefore that's got to be Moses. On the way down from the mountain, and I don't think it's in Mark, I think it's in Matthew, that they asked Jesus, wasn't Elijah supposed to come first? Jesus said Elijah has already come. Referring to John the Baptist, but also referring to the fact he had just saw him. So I'm thinking, it's funny because today, if George Washington were to descend upon a mountain, we would all recognize George Washington based on his picture. They did not have pictures or even drawings of Moses at that time. So it's not like they could say, oh yeah, that's Moses. Or, oh yeah, that's that guy on Channel 13. It would have been through the cloud that they recognized this is absolutely significant. And therefore, when they heard the voice from the cloud, they didn't think, oh, that's my stomach grumbling. They knew that this was a voice of God. And because of that, they knew that this would be people of significance. And probably the two most significant for them would be Moses and Elijah. It's also possible that they asked Jesus on the way down, who was that? But you see on the mountain that Peter says, we'll build 3 tabernacles or 3 tents for you, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah. So there was some kind of recognition. I'm guessing the cloud was the giveaway for that.
I'm trying to guess maybe there were name badges.
Maybe they had name badges. Yeah. Probably because, when we all get to heaven, we're not going to remember. We're not going to recognize everybody. Because, we're not going to look like this. We're going to look like we did in our prime. Isn't that wonderful to think about? We're going to be much younger when we get to heaven. Other questions? Other questions? No? All right. Why don't you go ahead and hit the button on that microphone and turn it to orange. All right. Well, as we get started, today's reading starts Holy Week. And we talked a little bit about this last week, just said that this is coming. We look at Jesus' triumphant entry. And then this whole series of things that happen between Jesus coming into Jerusalem, leading up to next Sunday, his arrest. He doesn't die this week, but he does go through everything else this week. Jack and Jerry, while I'm thinking about it, communion next Sunday. It's in the reading this week, so we'll do communion next Sunday. Yes. So be prepared for communion on Sunday. With Jesus' triumphant entry, when we look at this story, and I spent some time this week actually with the Quad City ministers looking over this passage, because for the Quad City Palm Sunday service, we're going to be using this and kind of reading through and working through this, the concept of the Palm Sunday and what this really meant. Here's the thing that I want us to keep in mind as we read this week. Everything that we're reading took the disciples by surprise, with the exception of the triumphant entry. Let that sink in for a minute. Everything that we're looking at took the disciples by surprise. When we read through this in Matthew, I told you how Jesus starts pushing buttons. And we see the exact same thing here. The disciples are thinking when Jesus comes in riding on the donkey. Now Jesus has at this point told them 3 times that he's going to die. We're going to Jerusalem. I'm going to die. And Mark writes down that they just didn't get it. They did not understand what he was saying until after he had died. But as he comes into Jerusalem, the disciples really start to get excited. I mean, you can sense that excitement because finally Jesus is letting people say who he is. A parade is exciting, right? I mean, most parades are exciting. Some are more exciting than others, but most parades are pretty exciting. When you see somebody coming down the road, and if you would imagine with me, Jesus coming down the road, he's riding on a donkey, sitting off to the side, we guess. And people are laying down their coats in front of him and waving palm branches and singing Hosanna, loud Hosanna. That's pretty exciting. To a group of people who have been waiting for this moment for over 2,000 years, they've been waiting for this moment. For the last 400 years, more specifically, they knew that the time was drawing near for the Messiah. It had been 400 years since they'd heard from God. We want the Messiah to be here so bad because we're so sick of the oppression of the Roman people. And they see Jesus coming into town, and his disciples are leading the way, and they're all so excited. That's what they expected the Messiah to be. They expected Jesus to come in and overthrow Rome. They expected him to come in a massive parade, and when he gets to the center of town, to come into the temple and say, "Troops, line up." And then to tell the Romans, "Be done," and to watch them all at the raising of his hand fall over dead. And the maggots immediately eat them. I mean, that was their dream, yeah. So with this triumphant entry, when we read this story, Jesus rides into town. And then it's kind of a big letdown. In Mark it says that he went back home to Bethany, or back into Bethany, and spent the night and then came back the next morning. And when they arrived the next morning, he went to the temple. He went to the temple and they were selling stuff there. And I mentioned when we read this in Matthew that there were actually only 2 or 3 years that we have recorded in history where they sold in the temple. Meaning they would typically sell all of the sheep for the sacrifices out on the Mount of Olives is where they would sell them. The mountains outside of Jerusalem. They wouldn't do that in the temple proper because that was just, it was desecrating the temple. They didn't like that. But for 3 years, or 2 or 3 year period here, Caiaphas was high priest, and he decided he wanted to compete with those who were selling out on the Mount of Olives. He said, more money for our coffers. So he decided to open it up then the convenience factor was huge. Because you ever tried to herd a sheep through chaos of masses of people, and hey, just come right here, step up, buy your sheep, take it next door, they'll sacrifice for you, one-stop shop. So there was a great pull for this, but yet it was very sacrilegious to the religious leaders, and they did not. He did it, but it really upset the people. And it really upset Jesus. And we don't know if Jesus' clearing of the temple had anything to do with him not doing this again. We don't know if it was exactly this year or the next year that he stopped. But he comes in and he starts overthrowing the tables. Now that part, the disciples probably weren't too surprised by and weren't too bothered by. Because they were pretty fed up with the Pharisees too. They were pretty fed up with the money-making mechanisms, the tax collectors, except for Matthew, he liked his friends. But they were pretty upset with this concept too. But Jesus, instead of then saying, okay, now I've cleared out the temple, call up the troops. Jesus then steps back and says, the scriptures declare my temple will be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have turned it into a den of thieves. They're probably expecting him to say something about, this is my house and this is war. No. It's supposed to be a house of prayer. Not a house of war, house of prayer. So we see again, he kind of steps back. He does enough to make them mad, make the Pharisees mad. And then the next time he comes back into town, as Jesus was walking through the temple area, the leading priests and teachers of the law and elders came up to him and demanded, by what authority are you doing these things? Who gave you the right to do them? Who gave you the right to overturn the temples or the tables and our money changing? Do you realize that I lost $20 off of you overthrowing my table? Who gave you the right? Who's going to pay me back? You get the gist of what they're saying. They're pretty upset about this. And Jesus responds, as he did in Matthew, by saying, I'll tell you by what authority I do these things if you'll answer one question. Did John's authority to baptize come from heaven, or was it merely human? Answer me. Tough question. Because if they say, well, John's authority was just human, then the crowds would get pretty frustrated, because remember, the crowds were going out to be baptized by John. They recognized something about this guy. If they say, well, it was from heaven, then he would say, well, then why did you not obey? They're stuck. Jesus could have left well enough alone. And he tells them, I won't tell you by what authority I do these things. Then Jesus began teaching them with stories. Matthew actually records 3 parables. Mark only records one of these. We remember that Matthew was an eyewitness, and so therefore he had more details. Mark tells us that he started teaching them with stories, but he only tells us one, and that is the parable of the evil farmers. A man planted a vineyard, built a wall around it, dug a pit for pressing out the grape juice, built a lookout tower, leased the vineyard to tenant farmers, and moved to another country. Set up pretty nice operation here. Set up a nice little, nice vineyard, had everything in place, ready to go. All they had to come in and do was tend the vines, and pretty easy deal. He's already put up all the capital, everything's in place, and then he went away. Now, here's the interesting thing, is that when Jesus tells this parable, he's referring to the nation of Israel. You may remember, I believe it's Isaiah chapter 5, where this story, a very similar story, is told through a perspective of God and His love for Israel. Now I will sing, this is Isaiah chapter 5, I will sing for the one I love a song about his vineyard. My beloved had a vineyard on a rich and fertile hill. He plowed the land, cleared its stones, planted it with the best vines. In the middle he built a watchtower and carved a wine press into the nearby rocks. Does that sound at all familiar? Yeah, same story. Except in this story, it says, then he waited for a harvest of sweet grapes, but the grapes that grew were bitter. When Jesus tells it, he said, he built it, went away, sent his servants back to collect his part of the harvest, and they hit him. There's a progression here. They grabbed the first servant and beat him up, sent him back empty-handed. Sent another servant, they hit him, insulted him, and he beat him over the head. The next servant was killed. Others he sent were either beaten or killed, until there was only one left, his son, whom he loved dearly. And they killed his son. Jesus is telling them their fate. He's telling them what's going to happen to them, which does exactly what he wanted it to do, which is to make them very, very angry. they left him and went away. Then we see later they sent some other Pharisees and supporters of Herod to trap Jesus into saying something for which he could be arrested. They come up and they just lay on the compliments, and Jesus sees right through it. It says Jesus saw through their hypocrisy. They ask him a pretty important question. Now, it's not that important to us. I mean, I wish it was, but it's not. Should we pay taxes to Caesar? Should we pay taxes? I see some of you shaking your heads. It's that time of year, for the wrong time of year to ask that question. Should we pay taxes? Not for what we're getting for it. Anyway, but see, taxes in those days were more than just paying taxes. Because Caesar thought of himself as more than just a ruler. He thought of himself as God. Augustus means divine. So he thought, and when Augustus Caesar took over as Caesar through a series of military conquests, they asked, what do you want us to call you? And he said, call me divine. Call me Augustus Caesar. What we see is this concept of paying taxes was not simply paying taxes, but it was a matter of worship. When you paid taxes to Caesar, it was the same as saying, we give to you because we worship you. Kind of like our concept of a tithe. We bring a tithe to God because we feel that He is worthy of our tithe. Everything that we have is a gift from Him anyway. It's His anyway. It's not ours. So we bring and give to Him a tithe of what He has given to us. Paying taxes to Caesar, Caesar viewed that as the same concept. Well, of course you would give it back to me because it all came from me anyway. Of course you would love to give me your money because I am a God and you want to please a God. Now, this created quite a conflict in the Jewish culture because the Jewish people only believed in one God, and it was not Caesar. Now, the Jewish people, the Jewish area was absolutely ripe for revolt. The Jewish people were the worst people to conquer of anybody in the Roman Empire because they just would not give up. The reason that we have the Old Testament is because they would not give up. They knew that they were chosen for something better. So when you came in and said, now you've got to worship our gods, not a chance. Here's an interesting concept, and then I'll come back to the tax thing. Interesting to note that when Pilate took over as the king or the ruler of this area, Pilate came in following one of Herod's sons. The first of Herod's sons that was ruling in that area was very corrupt, just like his father, but people didn't like him because he wasn't building them a magnificent temple, and so he was short-lived. Pilate comes in, and when Pilate comes into town, he comes in saying, I'm all that. And I'm not going to put up with this whiny stuff that you guys have been pulling. You're going to obey what I say or I'm going to kill you. When they came in, when Passover took place, the Romans knew that this was an extremely volatile time for the Jews. And so they would send extra forces, reinforcements into Jerusalem to make sure that there was no revolt taking place. Part of this is why the triumphant entry would have been a big concern, because this sure looks, well, kind of looks like a military parade to them. They're watching this unfold and saying, okay, why is everybody waving palm branches at this guy? Well, Pilate would send in extra reinforcements. But they had worked out an agreement. Herod would do the same thing. But when Herod would send in the extra troops, they would take the crest of Caesar off of the shields that they would use. They had special shields that they would use when they came into Jerusalem, because the crest said that Caesar was divine and we worship him. So when Pilate sent the troops in, he had them come in with the crests on the shields that said, Caesar is God and we will worship him. This did not set well with the Jewish people. It absolutely drove them crazy. And they raised a big stink about it. Pilate said, get over yourselves. I'm in charge here. You're not. Get over it. They kept pushing the issue. And Pilate kept getting deeper and deeper in the hole on this issue. Finally, he takes this group he takes the Jewish leaders and he said, I tell you what, I will give you a forum where you can come and share your opinions with me. Meet me in such and such an arena at such and such a time, and I will give you a forum. They all come in, they pack the place out, tell Pilate their opinion, and then Pilate has armed guards come and close the doors. Basically, he says to them, if you want to get out of this place alive, shut up and get over it. The Jews' response was to bend over and bare their necks and say, if you want to kill us, then kill us. But it's not because we're violent, it's because we believe in only one God. Guess who won that battle? The Jews won that battle. Which kind of sets up what we're going to see unfolding when Jesus is before Pilate. And Pilate wants to release Jesus. And they're saying, how dare you? You've already brought your crests into this town. That's strike one. Then you took us out and threatened to kill us. You lost there. That's strike two. How dare you say that you're not going to crucify Jesus when he's claiming to be a king? That is heresy. That is not acceptable. There is no king but Caesar. See, Pilate had to kill Jesus, or that would have been strike three, and Pilate would have been killed himself. You understand these pieces are in place ahead of this time. So when they say, should we pay taxes? This is a group of people who are willing to face their own death rather than worship Caesar. Rather than even allowing Pilate to send his troops in with the crest on their shield that said, worship Caesar. So should they pay taxes? Should they pay tribute? Should they worship Caesar by paying taxes? That's a very good question. And Jesus' answer is brilliant. He says, show me a Roman coin and I'll tell you. So they handed him a Roman coin. Whose picture and title are stamped on it? Caesar's, they replied. Well then, said Jesus, give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, but give to God what belongs to God. In other words, this piece of metal may have Caesar's picture on it, but it does not mean worship Caesar. Give Caesar what he wants, but give God the worship. It's not just a matter of paying taxes, it's worship. And Jesus separated those two and said, Caesar's picture's on the coin, give it to him. You're carrying it around in your pocket, worshiping it by carrying it around in your pocket. Give it to him. If he wants it, give it to him. But only worship God. His reply completely amazed them. Then they send somebody else to try to trap him. Ask him questions about a man who marries and dies with no children. And then all 6 of his brothers end up marrying the same woman, no children. And they say, well, whose wife will he be in the resurrection? And Jesus laughs at him. Says, your mistake is that you don't know the scriptures and you don't know the power of God. For when the dead rise, you will neither marry nor be given in marriage. In this respect, they will be like the angels in heaven. So he points them back to what they should know but don't. And acknowledge or sees through their lies or their tests there, their trap. The most important commandment. Are any of these stories sounding familiar? I mean, does it seem like we just went through this a few weeks ago? We did. Remember that Matthew used Mark as his template. So almost everything that we read here, we also read in Matthew. We read more detail in Matthew on most of the stories, not all. And then we're going to read it again in a couple weeks when we go through Luke. But there's enough diversity in it, enough differences that we really need to pay attention to these things. The most important commandment, that one is pretty similar to what we see in Matthew, whose son is a Messiah. The widow's offering, this one does not show up in Matthew to my remembrance. Jesus sat down near the collection box in the temple and watched as the crowds dropped in their money. Many rich people put in large amounts. Then a poor widow came and dropped in 2 small coins. Jesus called his disciples to him and said, I tell you the truth, this poor widow has given more than all the others who are making contributions. For they gave a tiny part of their surplus, but she, as poor as she is, has given everything that she had to live on. That's a pretty amazing story, isn't it? To see this woman who gives everything that she had to live on. You know, that wasn't really her choice to give everything that she had to live on. You see, the Pharisees had this thing. They didn't want just anybody being able to come into the temple and give an offering. They really didn't want people in the temple as much. That was their space. Keep those heathen, those poor people out of there. So they set up a rule, a 2-coin minimum. You can't come in and give in the offering unless you give a 2-coin minimum. Now, doesn't that sound like a politician? I mean, a Pharisee? Sorry, digress for a moment there. You can't come in and worship unless you give at least 2 coins. Now, this woman desperately wanted to worship, but she only had 2 coins. She could have worshiped just as much by giving 1 coin and still had dinner that night. But there was a 2-coin minimum. So she comes in to give her offering. And she drops in everything that she has. Now this stuck out to Peter. Peter remembered this, and Peter preached on this, and Mark wrote this down. When Jesus said, this woman has given more than any of the rest. Because she's given not out of her surplus, but she has given everything. But there's a hint in that of Jesus' disgust with the Pharisees. Why do you make these stupid rules to make yourselves look good, but make it to where people can't come to the temple and still have dinner? Then we see that Jesus talks about the future. Don't let anyone mislead you, for many will come in my name, claiming to be the Messiah. They will deceive many. You will hear of wars and threats of wars, but don't panic. Yes, these things must take place for the end, but the end won't follow immediately. Nation will go to war against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in many parts of the world as well as famines, but this is only the first of the birth pains, with many more to come. When these things begin to happen, watch out. You will be handed over to the local councils, and you will be beaten in the synagogues. You will stand trial before governors and kings because you are my followers. Then you will be given your opportunity to tell them about me. For the good news must first be preached to all the nations. There's a lot to be said about that verse. The good news must first be preached to all the nations. There's a lot of study that's taking place about the end times. There's a lot of people who devote their entire life study to studying the end times. When's it going to happen? Now, Harold Camping, I saw, came out this week with a new bulletin. He said, I give up. I was sure that it was going to be May 21st or whatever it was, and I was sure it was going to be October. I'm an old man. I'm not going to make any more guesses, because that wasn't actually his first. He'd actually done this years ago. He finally came out and said, I give up. You see, Harold Camping is not a biblical scholar. He's not someone who has gone through the educational process. He's just picked up a Bible and started reading it and thought that, you know what, there's codes in other writing. I'm going to find a code here that'll tell me the answer. I can promise you this, there's no code in the Bible that's going to tell you when the end times are going to happen. Jesus clearly states Yeah, I saw it in here earlier too. I just can't find it right now. You too must keep watch, for you don't know when the master of the household will return. In the evening, at midnight, and before dawn or at daybreak. Don't let him find you sleeping when he arrives without warning. I say to you what I say to everyone. Watch out for him. Be ready, but you don't know. You won't know. You can't sit here and read and figure it all out. It's not in here. I believe that one of the reasons that it's not in here is because all the nations don't know yet. Until every nation knows and has the opportunity to receive or reject Jesus Christ, He's not coming back. Now, should this cause us to give more importance to missions? You bet. Because this world's getting to be a pretty nasty place. There's a reason that I'm excited to be a Nazarene. I don't agree with everything the Nazarenes do. There's politics in the Nazarene church just like there is in every church. It drives me crazy. One of my biggest praises of the Nazarene church is our missions program. One of the reasons that I'm not looking to go anywhere else as a pastor, even though I disagree with some of the political stuff, is because I recognize that the Nazarene church places utmost importance on missions. We are one of 3 denominations that pays our missionary salaries. You don't know how significant that is unless you served on the mission field. My father-in-law married a woman. His first wife passed away, and his new wife has a son who's a missionary to Brazil. And he had to come back midterm because his funding ran out when the economy collapsed. He's had to live on credit cards because his funding ran out. He's had to sell his house here in the United States because his funding ran out. And he has no money coming in from the denomination. In fact, he has to raise not only his support, but he has to raise, in addition to his annual support, he has to raise 20% for the ministry. Now put that on the shoulders of someone and say, go preach the gospel to all the nations, but first raise 120% of what you need for a year's salary. That's a heavy burden. That's going to keep people from going and preaching the gospel. With the Nazarene denomination, we pay 100% of our missionary salaries. We pay for their health insurance. So when they're on the field, they're not worrying about, is my funding going to dry up? Because in Kevin's case, he had it all lined up when we went over there, but it was supposed to come in on a monthly basis. The economy dried up, churches started receiving less, churches started sending him less, individuals started sending him less, and all of a sudden his funding is gone. And he had to come back. Actually, it kind of worked out. He came back for Janelle's dad's wedding to try to raise, while he was back for that wedding, enough money to last him another 8 months until he came back on furlough. And now he's trying to go out and speak and raise money so that he can go back for another 5 years. That's a rough deal when your passion is not here, it's there. In the Nazarene church with our missionaries, when our missionaries come out and speak, we take offerings for them. But that offering does not go to pay for their salary. That offering goes to pay for their ministry. Meaning, when we raise funds for a missionary, those funds that we give them when they come are funds that they use to fund the programs that they're running. It's funds that they use to fund the ministry that they're doing, to pay for their vehicles while they're there, vehicle repairs while they're there, but not, can we afford to live? Are we going to have food to eat? The Nazarene Church has a great program for those of you who are new to the Nazarene Church. I believe that that's essential because I believe that Jesus is not coming back until all the nations know.
Do we know what percentage is left?
There are people that know. I'm not one of them. I think last time I heard, and this is when I was in college, it was between 70 and 80%, I think, of the world knows. Now, half the world needs to be re-evangelized, meaning United States, for example, is now a mission field. It's not the sending nation anymore. It's now the mission field. Europe needs to be re-evangelized because they've heard it, but they don't get it. But I think it was about 20%, 20 to 30% of the world that did not know. And the Nazarene Church right now is in 153 or 154 nations I think was the last number I heard. So we're making a lot of progress. There's a lot of churches making a lot of progress, but there's still a lot left to go. That passage makes, how many of you have seen the movie At the End of the Spear? Jim Elliott story? That makes that story of going into the Amazon so much more powerful. Yeah. So Jesus talks about the future and basically says, guys, don't pay attention, be ready, but don't spend your life worrying about this. Then we see the woman who anoints Jesus with the alabaster offering. Why waste such expensive perfume, they ask. Could have been sold for a year's wages and the money giving to the poor. So they scolded her harshly. And Jesus replied, leave her alone. She just worshiped me. And worship is important. Judas agrees to betray Jesus. And then we see the Last Supper. When you look at the Last Supper, Mark adds a few details that Matthew does not add, and I want us to kind of conclude tonight looking at these details. On the first day of the festival of unleavened bread, when the Passover lamb is sacrificed, Jesus' disciples ask him, where do you want us to go to prepare the Passover meal for you? So Jesus sent 2 of them into Jerusalem with these instructions. My guess is that one of the 2 was Peter, and the other was John. I think that's how it's phrased elsewhere. And Peter would remember these instructions, whereas Matthew would not, because Matthew was not given these instructions. Peter was. As you go into the city, reading in verse 13, a man carrying a pitcher of water will meet you. Follow him. At the house he enters, say to the owner, the teacher asks, where is the guest room where I can eat the Passover meal with my disciples? He will take you upstairs to a large room that is already set up. That is where you should prepare our meal. So the disciples went into the city and found everything just as Jesus had said, and they prepared the Passover meal there. Do you get what Jesus just said? They're coming in. Now in Jerusalem at this time, this is the busiest time of year for Jerusalem, one of the busiest times of year. There's millions of people converging on Jerusalem. And as they're coming close to Jerusalem, it's hard to find a place to have Passover. And the law said that the Passover meal had to be eaten inside of the city gates of Jerusalem. Couldn't do it out in Bethany. Had to be in Jerusalem. And Jesus' disciples ask him, Lord, where are we going to have the Passover meal? And he says, let me get on my phone, make a few calls, we'll see what I can work out. All right, here's the deal. No, he doesn't call anybody. He says, take a walk. Now, notice that they came to him. He didn't pull them aside and say, okay, guys, the appointed time is here. They came to him. And they said, what are we going to do this? He said, here's what you do. You go into town. As soon as you get into town, there's going to be a man carrying a water jug. Follow him home. When you follow him home, go into that house and tell the master of that house that the teacher wants to know where the room is. Do you get how far out that is? I mean, if I were to say, go up to Hy-Vee and you're going to find somebody carrying a cell phone, follow them home. And when you get there, ask them, Pastor Emmanuel wants to know when dinner's going to be ready.
But men didn't carry the water.
Men didn't carry the water, so that was one of the distinguishing facts. That's why he was looking for a man, not a woman. But who was carrying water at that time? The Passover would have been the only time that men would have had to step in and help. But you're right, the men typically did not carry the water, which is how it made them easier in this crowd of 1 million people to spot a man carrying the water instead of a bunch of women carrying the water. If he'd said, go find a woman carrying water, yeah, that would have been a little bit harder. So he said, find a man. There was only one man willing to carry water that day, or forced into it. So they get into town and find it just as Jesus said. You get that? Walk into town, there's going to be a guy carrying a water jug. Follow him home. I'm wondering what that guy's thinking. there's a big crowd, so they're trying to stay close. And here he is, he's carrying the water jug. He probably, as a guy, feels self-conscious enough about this. Oh, what are they going to think? Hope my kids don't see me. I hope nobody knows me, sees me. You guys following me? He does a couple of evasive moves and they just follow him along. They follow him home. He comes in the house first. He's like, I don't know what the deal is. These guys have been following me home. I don't know if it's just because I've never seen a guy carry a water jug or what it is, but they're following me home. They come in and they ask to speak to the master of the house. Maybe he's thinking, good, this is going to get me out of water duty. They're going to tell my master how terrible it is for him to send me out to get the water. And the master says, they ask the master where teacher wants to know where he can have the Passover. Where's the room? And the man doesn't question them. The man doesn't say, what teacher? The man doesn't say, check the Super 8 because we're all full here. The man takes them and shows them a furnished room and they make preparations. You see, here's the deal. Last time when we read through this passage, I wanted you to see how Jesus was pushing buttons. This time when you're reading through this passage, I want you to see how Jesus had every detail planned out. This is not an accident. It is not by chance that Jesus comes in to this situation. It is not by chance that he ends up on the cross. Every detail is planned out. Every one of them. Every one of them. Down to where are they going to celebrate the Passover? So we see that after they celebrate the Passover meal, Peter has a little bit too much wine, gets a little bit obnoxious. Jesus says that he's going to die. Peter says, never. Jesus turns around and tells him, I tell you the truth, Peter, this very night before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. I'm just joking when I say Peter had too much wine. I'm guessing that Peter was boisterous enough without the wine. Then they went out to the olive grove and to a Gethsemane, which we watched a video on last time, I think, while I was gone. And there he's praying. As he's praying, he kept coming back to his disciples and found them asleep. He woke them up twice. And then the third time he returned to them and he said, go ahead and sleep, have your rest. They were asleep. How did they know what he said? This is one of those questions kind of like, how did they know it was Moses? They were asleep. How did they know what he said?
Well, I have maybe an idea.
Okay.
Well, today in the Transfiguration, one of the, I think it was Luke, might have been the one that said, or maybe it was Matthew, because we were looking at all 3 and comparing the Transfiguration. It said that they had fallen asleep, and then it also describes them being very fearful. And maybe in the garden it's the same kind of a sleep where you're asleep with sort of like a kind of a sleep where you were easily wakened. That because you're scared and you're just exhausted, you're scared, so your sleep is fitful, and so any little thing you would jump.
Okay. It could have been. I also like to look at verse 50, because I think verse 50 of chapter 14 might be the way that they knew too. Then all his disciples deserted him and ran away, but one young man following behind was clothed only in a long linen shirt. When the mob tried to grab him, he slipped out of his shirt and ran away naked. I personally think that Mark was hiding in the shadows. Because you see, here's the thing. We know that Mark's mother was a wealthy woman. Some people believe that Mark's mother and father owned the house where they had the Last Supper. We know that that was a gathering place for the disciples after Peter was arrested and the angel released him from jail in the book of Acts. He goes to the house where they were all meeting, which happens to be the house owned by John Mark's mother. would it not make sense that they would have found that to be a favorite gathering place because that's where they celebrated the Last Supper together? Don't know for sure. It's speculation because we won't know until we get to heaven. But it's very possible that that's the house that it was at. So when Jesus and his disciples, they sang a song and after communion and they went out to the Mount of Olives, I just happen to wonder if maybe a little boy wasn't kind of hiding in the corner watching. And then when they left, he just kind of followed along behind them. He already had his pajamas on. He was supposed to be in bed. And then when the soldiers came and he gets scared and everybody starts running and he runs too, and somebody's saying, "What's a little boy doing out here?" and tries to grab him, and he loses his shirt and runs home naked. It very well could have been the fitful sleep, but it also very well could have been the fact that there was a little boy watching who's writing this letter for us to read. We'll read this week, next Sunday actually, Jesus going before the council. His prediction about Peter comes true. And then next week we will start into the crucifixion and the resurrection. Believe it or not, I think next week we finish up the Gospel of Mark. Matthew took a month and a half and Mark takes less than a month. And then Luke's going to take quite a while. Any questions before we close? Well, I hope that this is helping you as you read. I think there's so much, as Joe mentioned, and I know Joe's gone now, there's so much more to Scripture than just reading it. We understand so much better the message that Jesus was trying to convey, not just the words that were written down, but the message that he was trying to convey. And I think that doing Scripture or doing study this way, where we're looking at it all in context, we're just reading in order, helps us to see the big picture, the big thoughts that are taking place, versus our typical Bible study, which is just pulling a verse out of here and pulling a verse out of here and proving a thought. When we're looking at the whole spectrum of this, we start to see a different picture emerge. We're especially going to see this when we get into Acts and the letters. And here's the big picture that emerges, and I want you to keep that in mind as we read this week and every week. The big picture is that Jesus came so that we could have relationship with him. And as I said this morning, he said, there is nothing worth more than the relationship with me. Now, take that relationship seriously and go and make disciples who will do the same. Thus our mission, training disciples who passionately seek God through prayer, worship, and fellowship. It's not about us. It's not about us feeling good. It's about him and his mission. Make sense? Lisa, will you close us in prayer tonight?